Hey guys, so this is the start of a new series I'm working on covering the Django REST Framework. So in this video, what I'll do is introduce you to what it is and basic concepts like serializing data and rendering it out in JSON format and create, update, and delete functionality. So we'll cover that in this video. Later on in the series, we'll go over things like token authentication, filtering data, and much more. So make sure you're subscribed and watching for that. And if you want to actually use what we built today, we're actually going to apply this in a real app that we'll follow up with in two different videos. So we're going to build a to-do app with one using vanilla JavaScript that will call this REST API, and another with React.js for anybody looking to integrate those two. So we're going to build that out, and it's a good way to actually understand what we built today and just to apply it and understand that CRUD functionality. So what's a REST API and why might we need it? A REST API is basically a way to provide data in a unison format, so typically JSON data, and it allows multiple applications to interact with one central hub. So REST API will provide that data, but if we want to allow another user to interact with it, we can just give them access, and they'll see something like this right here in JSON format. And another example might be if we want to build out an app with React, or maybe a mobile app with Flutter or React Native. These will require some kind of a REST API to tap into. So we'll have to get that data from somewhere, which is what we're going to build out today, and a way to interact with it. Okay, so before we get started, I want to show you the Django REST Framework documentation. And this is a great resource for beginners and anybody working within it, because there's a lot of concepts to cover here. And I still reference this daily, so it's a really good resource on all of the topics and everything that we need to do with the Django REST Framework. So the Django REST Framework is just a way to build out REST APIs using Django. So it's just a toolkit that we can work with, and it gives us a lot of extra functionality to be able to do this. So in order to install it, we'll cover our application here in a second, but before this, we'll actually install it in a minute, but that's how you install it. So pip install Django REST Framework, and we add it to our installed app. So before we do that, let's go ahead and look at the app that I have set up here. So I just created a simple app or a simple project, and the app within it I just called API. So normally you can do this with by creating your own folder and creating all the files, but I just wanted to get a quick start, so I just made it its own app. So the app, or the API app, will just hold the model. So this is going to be a to-do app. So the API is going to be based on a to-do app that we're creating, and that to-do app is just going to have the model of task, and that task will have a title, so something like get milk or something like that, and is that task complete? So that's just a Boolean field. And if we look at this, it's configured in installed apps. And in our URL path, anything with a /API will take us to the API app. And in here, we just have that URL pattern. And for now, I just have a view called API overview. So we'll go ahead and change this. And this view is just going to show us all the URL patterns that we're going to have. So it's just going to be just a dictionary, a JSON response, and it's going to show us some data. So let's go ahead and actually run the install. And one thing I wanted to make clear for anybody here that might think this is a basic Django tutorial, it's not. This is for the Django REST Framework. So this is for building out APIs. I just wanted to make sure nobody got confused with that. So let's go to the documentation and run this pip install. So I'll just copy and paste that. And in here, we'll just run that install. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and add it to installed apps, and I'll show you what we have in that URL path. So let's go ahead and bring this back in here. I have two screens open, so it's kind of acting funny. So we just need to add this to our settings.py installed apps. So go ahead and paste that in there, and that's it. So now we have access to everything that the Django REST Framework gives us. So let's go ahead and turn on our server, and let's set up some URL routes. So python manage.py, run server. And I'll just show you what this view has here. So we'll close out settings, close out this URL path, and we're just going to render out this view. So if I open that up and go to that base pattern now, because we have that URL pattern, we're going to get this page right here, because in that urls.py file, the only route I have right now is to /API. So that's a simple JSON response. And in here, what we want to do is convert this into a JSON REST framework response. So an actual API response. So let's go ahead and run a few imports here. So if you go to the documentation and look into tutorial and request and response, we need access to this response method right here. And we also need to add a decorator to make sure our view is a view that can access the methods that Django REST Framework gives us. So we can use class-based views or function-based views. And because I'm using function-based views, we need to add this decorator right here. So let's go ahead and run those imports. So I'll go ahead and just paste them in and I'll explain what's going on here. So we're going to import from REST framework.decorators API view. And we're also going to import from REST framework.response. We're going to import that response method. So what that allows us to do now is if we go here, it allows us to use this API view decorator. So if I go ahead and paste that in, that will now allow us to have the functionality that Django REST Framework gives us. So we only want to allow the get method here, and we also need to change this JSON response to a Django REST Framework response. So with that being said, what we're going to do now is actually return some URL patterns that we need to set up. So this view is meant to just be an overview. So anybody that wants to work with our REST API, if they want to see the URL routes, they can go ahead and just do API or our URL and then API, and they'll see a bunch of URL patterns. So I'll go ahead and paste that in. And we'll go ahead and just return that. So I'll just indent this. And this is the list of URL patterns we're going to make now. So we're going to create a list of to-do objects that we can use, a detail view, which will allow us to just see one object based on the ID that we pass in, a way to create, update, and delete. So with that, I just need to go ahead and return this. So if we just eliminate all of that and return API URLs, you're going to see a different response now in our browser here. So let's go ahead and refresh this. And this is going to look a little different. So we can work with it just like we would any other JSON response, but it gives us a little extra detail on what's going on here. So that's the URL patterns that we have. We used a get method on that, and we can view it just as a normal JSON response if we change that. So if you look at the URL pattern, that changed right there. So this is what we just set up. And now what we want to do is work with serializing data. So what that's going to do is allow us to return any model object here in a JSON response. So it's just going to be a JSON object. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is create a file called serializers.py. So go ahead and save that. So serializers.py. And in here, what we're going to do is create a class and specify which model we want to serialize. Once we create that in here, we can start using it in our view. So in Serializers, I'm just going to paste in another import. And this is going to be from REST Framework, import Serializers. And now let's just go ahead and import our models. So from .models, because we are in the same path as our model, we're just going to import task. This is the model that we want to serialize. And if you've ever used model forms, it's very similar to that, where we create a class, and I'm going to follow the method or the practice of using the model name and just saying serializer. So it's going to be task serializer, and we're going to say serializers dot, oops, put that outside there. Let's paste that back in here. And that's going to be serializers dot model serializer. And you can serialize any form of data. You can actually create custom data here. But we want to serialize a model, so that's what we're going to work with here. And I spelled that wrong originally. So we have our model serializer, and we just need to do class meta. And we need 2 attributes just to make this work. We can add more later, but we first need the model we're going to serialize, and that's going to be task, which we just imported. and we need to know how many fields do we want to display. So which fields do we want to allow to see? So fields, we're just going to use, we want to display all of them. So we're going to do double underscore all and double underscore. So that will serialize an object. So we created our serializer, and what we need to do now is import our serializer into the view. So I keep misspelling serializer. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and paste this in here. I pre-wrote it from .serializer. So from this file, we're going to import that task serializer. So we're going to do import, and we're just going to get this serializer, and we're going to work with task serializer. So let's go ahead and make a list of responses so we can see all of the data in our database. So I actually went ahead and created a few tasks. So a couple of items that will be rendered out from our to-do list. So this one we're gonna call task view. So just being a function, and we're gonna call this task list, and we're gonna camel case that, and let's go ahead and do request, and we'll just return, whoops, keep spelling that wrong. So we're just gonna go ahead and return that response. So return, and that's gonna be this response right here. So let's go ahead and paste that in. And let's actually go ahead and get these tasks. So we're going to do tasks, and then that's going to be equal to task.objects.all. So we're just going to query the task. And what we're going to do now is set the serializer. So we're going to say serializer, and not serializers. And that's going to be equal to task serializer. So we query the objects, and in here, we're just going to throw the objects into that serializer. So this will take care of actually serializing that data. So we'll just set the tasks there. And now we need to specify, do we want to serialize one object, or do we want to have a list of them? So we're going to say many is equal to true. And later on, we'll actually set this to false when we're just querying one item. So for serializer, what we just need to do is serializer.data, and that will now query our database, serialize the data, and return it in our API response. So now we just need to create a URL path for this. And before I forget, we need to import the models and put a decorator above our views. So from models import, and we'll just do task. So we need to import that before we can call it. And let's go ahead and put a decorator above here. So we only want to allow a get response or get call. So let's go ahead and finish up our URL pattern. So in our URLs, let's go ahead and grab this path right here, and we'll just work off this. So we're going to call this task-list, and then /, and then we're just going to use this view. So we'll just go ahead and paste that in, and we're also going to just name it task-list. So I want to change that. And now if I go to our browser here, and I do API /task-list. So what we have right here. So now if I go there, we should see a response of all the objects. So this is all of our data, and you can see we have the ID, title, and the completed status. So we can actually begin making API calls and working with this data. Now what I want to do is return a detail view. So right now we're returning a list, but let's say I want to return item number 1 or item number 3 on the list. So in order to do this, we're going to create a detail view, and in here within our view, it's very similar to this. We're just going to get the task list, and I'll go ahead and just paste this and start working with this functionality and changing up a few things. So this will be changed to task detail, and we want to pass in the primary key or ID. So same thing there, and we'll do task.objects.get. And this ID will equal to whatever we pass in. And the serializer, so we're using the same serializer, we just query one object, and we change many to false. So this means it's just going to return one object based on whatever we're querying. So for this, we're just going to do task detail. So I'll just paste that, and we'll just change this to detail. And at this point, everything's just going to be rinse and repeat until we actually get into updating items and deleting. So detail, and we'll use this view and change that. So with that, all I have to do now is use task detail. And I actually forgot one part here, so let's fix this before we get an error. Let's go ahead and pass in that primary key. So we'll just do PK, and that's how we're able to access it right here. So we'll just do /, and I know everybody has their own method of doing this. I just, for tutorials, I keep it simple like that. And now if I pass in the ID of 1, there we go. And if I change that to 2, so that's given us our object information. So this is if we want to just retrieve one item. So let's go ahead and actually handle create functionality, update, and delete. So we'll just finish these up and that'll be the end of the video. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we're going to work with a detail view, and we don't need a primary key, and we are going to send post data. So this view will only allow a post method. So in here, what we're going to do is just set serializer is going to be equal to task serializer, and we're going to pass in some data. So the data is going to be equal to request.data. So if you're familiar with model forms, normally we do something like request.post, but because this is an API view, we have access to request.data. And if you look at the documentation, basically request.data sends us a JSON object, and that's how we can work with it. So we're just going to go ahead and throw that in, and we can actually save this like we would a standard any kind of model form or just a form. So we're just going to do if serializer dot is underscore valid, and I thought that was pretty cool that we can just call it just like that, like a form right there. So we'll just do if serializer dot is valid, serializer dot save. So if it's valid, it'll actually send that item back to the database and save it. So I'm not going to work with error handling or anything like that. So let's go ahead and save that, and we're going to make this task create. Forgot to name the view. So we'll do task create, and in our URL patterns, let's go ahead and use task list because we are not passing an ID, so this will be easier to copy off of. So we're going to pass in task create view, and we'll just change up all these. And now what we can do is I'm actually going to copy this object here because we need to send a JSON object, and we're going to change this to create, and let's go ahead and remove that. So now all I have to do is throw in an object. I'll remove that comma, and we'll just say new item. So if we send this as a post method, and I've seen a lot of people use Postman for this, I'm just going to use this just because it works the same. Might not work as good, but it'll get the point across. So if I send that post data, we see that new item returned because we, after saving that item, return the data. But if I look at the list and refresh it, there we go. So we sent that data into that view, and the serializer took in that data and went ahead and saved that. So now let's just do update. So if I go ahead and copy this, this is also going to be a post request. So we're going to leave that decorator as post right here, but we will change this to update. And we also want to pass in the primary key, so PK. And with this one, what we want to do is actually grab the item first. So we'll go ahead and throw that in right here, and that's going to be task. And we're going to get the object that we want to update. Data is going to equal to request.data. But just like the form, we're going to set the instance. So instead of creating a new item, we're going to set instance to, and we're going to update the instance of the item that's in the ID. So serializer instance is that task. We go ahead and check if it's valid and save that. So let's go ahead and now change this path here. So we'll go ahead and change that to update, task update. And I think you'll start noticing a pattern of what's going on here. So it's very standard to how you would normally handle CRUD in Django, just a little bit different with things like the serializer and request.data. So task update, let's go ahead and fix that, update. And I think that's everything. So now if we go to task update, and we'll just update the first item. Actually, let's update this one right here. So item number 6. So task update, we'll pass in the URL. And now we want to update it. So we have the item, and let's just say updated. So if I hit post, it takes the post method, and item is now updated. So there we go, update. So last, let's just finish up the delete method, and then we can actually move on. If you're interested in actually using this information or using this API in a real application, we'll actually do this with a to-do app on the front end. So let's go ahead and finish up with a delete method. And delete is going to be, let's go ahead and paste that in. We'll just change this to task.delete. And instead of a post method, we're actually going to take in delete. So that's its own method. And with this, what we want to do is grab the task, and we don't need to serialize it. We're just going to do delete. So task and task.delete. So just the delete method, that's pretty standard. We're just calling it on the model, and all we're doing now is creating a URL path for that. So let's go ahead and throw that in and delete, and we'll throw in delete there and pass in the view. So let's go ahead and try that out. So now if I just do task delete, but we want to update or delete, let's say the first item. So let's just do item number 1 and see how this works. And I think I can throw in the delete method. Yeah, so I'm going to use the delete method. Again, you'd normally send this from the front end, so you'd pass it in the request. Once it's, let's see what's going on here. Did that delete it? Okay, so that did delete it, and it looks like our error comes in this response, and that's because we're calling serializer.data. That was just a copy and paste error. So I'm just going to return this message and say item successfully deleted. So what we're going to do in the next video, before we continue on with the Django REST Framework series, is create this to-do app in 2 different projects. So we're going to call the REST API that we just built out and render this data and actually handle that CRUD functionality with just JavaScript. And then we'll actually do it with React for anybody that's interested in that. So we're going to work with this data. It's going to be a cool experience if you want to actually go through that full process. So make sure you're following. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.